This video was produced by
on regional development policy track. We've got Bruce Buckheit from Princeton Energy Resources International. I'm not going to go through everybody's background because you've got the biographical sketches that has that, and I think we'd like to focus on the substance. You can read about their background. We also have Al Christopher, the Director of the Energy Division of the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. And we have Ken Hutcheson, who is the President of the Virginia Alternative and Renewable Energy Association. So they are very knowledgeable about what's going on in Virginia. And what I'm going to do is start with a little background. If you can put up the slide on the renewable portfolio standards. Bruce and Ken are going to discuss the barriers to onshore and offshore wind and efforts to overcome these barriers. Al is going to talk on offshore wind specifically. And what I wanted to do is just to provide a little context before we go forward. The lunchtime speaker spoke about the large resource of offshore wind in Virginia and some of the promise and some of the barriers there. Al will go into that more. In terms of onshore wind, there is 600 megawatts of onshore wind in the interconnection queue of the PJM interconnection. For those of you who don't know what the PJM interconnection is, that is the grid for the regional area that we're in. And what that means is it's an expression of interest, and I believe there actually is some money that the developer has to put behind that they would like to interconnect their wind resource to the queue. But it does not in any way mean that that is for sure going forward, that will be developed. And so companies like the Mesa have put things in the interconnection queue and then dropped out of the queue. As Bruce is going to talk about, there are some very major barriers that we've got. But I did want to say there are a few things that have been done in the state. The permit by rule effort, which was led by Carol Wampler at DEQ, was a major effort that has been completed, which is to help overcome some of the problems and obstacles that were encountered in the Highland New Wind Energy Project in terms of opposition from those wildlife interests. There was not a real clear pathway, and so the efforts by the permit by rule do set a clearer pathway in terms of the avian and bat issues. There also has been significant state funding in terms of offshore wind that Al will talk about. And there has been some efforts to strengthen the state energy plan, which Ken will speak about. However, bottom line is, as you can see from this, actually, I'll just shift to the other map, to the second slide. Bottom line is there is, it's not above, okay. Is it up now? Okay. Bottom line is you can see from this white on the map that there is no installed wind power in Virginia. Now, Virginia is not alone in that regard. As you can see, most of the area of the southeast is what one might call a dead zone. And there are some major, this is a policy session, and what we're going to talk about is some of the major policy drivers that lead to that situation. So, you can go back to the first slide. And one of the main policy points here is that the states, and you can compare these two when you later after this session, we'll post these on the website. The states that have the most significant wind development are the 29 states with mandatory renewable portfolio standards. Virginia just has a voluntary renewable portfolio standard. It is one of 8 states in that category. But it was noteworthy when I went through those states, it's actually the only one of the 8 states, even with a voluntary standard, that does not have wind development. Many of the other states that have voluntary portfolio standards, such as Oklahoma, West Virginia, do have significant wind development. And so Bruce will do a very good job, I believe, of pointing out why, in terms of the way that some people say in the legislative area, the devil is in the details. And if you look into the details of the Virginia statute and the way that the statute has been interpreted by the State Corporation Commission, which is the Public Utility Commission in Virginia, you will start to understand why that voluntary standard has not been very effective. And most of you probably know that in terms of the United States, the biggest driver for wind has been the renewable portfolio standard, as well as the production tax credit, which is a federal incentive, which is the subject of the next session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce to give his presentation.
Thank you, Deborah, and good afternoon, folks. I'm actually delighted to be back on the campus. I have to say my oldest daughter's class of 2007 was a Duquette, and her freshman year dorm was about 300 yards from me. I do have a disclaimer to offer, though. I'm not actually an employee of Perry. Their hiring standards are much more stringent than that. I'm a consultant. I'm engaged with Perry on a DOE-sponsored effort to identify the barriers to the development of wind power in the mid-Atlantic states. It seems that wind power is doing fine in such conservative places as Texas, which in a period of a few years ramped up and now passed California in terms of wind power development, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. And so the question DOE asked to be looked at is, how come all those places and not North Carolina, Maryland, Virginia, Delaware? I agree with what Debra has said about what's in the queue on the PJM, but I would point out that there have been numbers of projects in the queue, including Highland Falls, the Duke Energy, Dominion Partnership, there's an Iberdola project down in North Carolina. These things come and go as plans are developed and then abandoned. But right now, I'm not aware of any projects that are likely to come to fruition in Virginia. And so why not? Let me eliminate a couple things before I get into what the problems might be. The problem, I don't think, lies in the voluntary nature of Virginia's renewable portfolio standard. The financial incentives, and we'll get into this in great detail, are so large under this program that both of the IOUs who could qualify have volunteered to do the program. And so that's not it. Another subject area that is not the problem is state permitting. So no one's going to care. There's not going to be an issue with respect to view sheds if you put up a wind farm. And once that starts happening, everybody else gets the idea to put up their wind farm. I have this on a data stick if that would help.
I think someone's on their way.
Oh, okay. What you have in Virginia is you have these ridgeline resources in the western part of the state and coastal resources in the eastern part of the state. And especially up around here, if we get these wind power maps up, you'll see that it's really just the ridge tops, the wind resource. And you have I-81 running right down the middle, and so the most likely places to put wind farms are places where everybody's going to see it for miles. And so they're going to be view shed issues. I think there's sort of an undercurrent of small p politics involved in all of this, because as the environmentalists are for wind power generally, because they don't like coal, those folks who are not offended by the use of coal to make electricity say right back at you, and we hate wind farms. In the southern part of the state, if you look at Floyd County and Wise County, you have a little bit more dispersion, so there might be some opportunities there. And others on our panel are going to talk about zoning issues with respect to that. But you don't have situations in Pennsylvania, their quote mountainous areas are really quite broad. 50 miles by 50 miles or something like that would be an area that you could look at. Here you just have a narrow strip where it's highly visible and you can see reasons, logical reasons why viewshed issues might pop up. You have some counties, and different counties have reacted to this in different ways, and again, others will get into the details. I think this is an area that we're going to bump through it, and it'll start in some counties, and then maybe other counties will change their mind later. So here's, up in here you have very narrow ridgeline areas where you have some resources. You get a little broader dispersion down in Floyd County and Wise County.
Microphone.
Thank you. Okay, for the tape, we have an area of a relatively narrow, thin ribbon of ridges. Again, you're bounded by the Shenandoah Valley and National Parks and the Appalachian Trail. And then down around Floyd County and Wise County, you have a little bit more dispersed area where you could see that there might not be as many viewshed issues. And then we have the area over here, the Eastern Shore, where both the Eastern Shore of the Chesapeake and the Western Shore of the Chesapeake show reasonable wind resources. And this is an NREL map where they're only looking at what's on land. We submit that if you look, there's every reason to think that the same resource extends across the bay in the lower bay. Okay, so as I said earlier, others will talk about the zoning fights that have been going on. Some counties accept it and others don't. The point I would make is because of this relatively limited distribution, the decisions of a few local zoning boards will have a lot to do with whether onshore wind resources are developed in Virginia. Let's go to the next slide just very quickly. Here's around here, and again, you see these very narrow strips where you might be able to put a series of turbines on a ridge, but not an area where you can get back out of sight of your neighbors. Next slide, please. Okay, now we get to the meat of this. Virginia has adopted a renewable portfolio program that, as I mentioned, is voluntary, but it provides very substantial incentives for the IOUs to participate. Nominally, if a company signs up to meet these goals, it will be reimbursed for its costs, and it will be awarded nominally a 0.5% increase in its rate of return on equity. The State Corporation Commission actually read the details, the fine print of this legislation, and they interpreted, and I think they're right, that actually there are incentive bonuses within this program where the overall benefit to the company can range from 0% to 1.5%. The goal, like most other state programs, is escalates over time, but it's not anywhere near as big as it looks on first reading. First of all, it's not a percentage of all electricity generated in the state, it's a percentage of the non-nuclear energy generated in the state, and we have a fairly substantial portion of our electricity is nuclear. And the percent rises over time, but the basis stays the same. It's not a percentage of the electricity that is generated in 2020, for instance. It's a rising percentage of the electricity that was generated in 2007. So the actual percent of overall electricity that's involved decays over time, if you will. relative numbers, even though it increases. Most importantly, and I used to work for the Justice Department's Environmental Enforcement Section and then EPA's air program for many years. And in those days, we had emission trading programs became popular for the acid rain program, etc. And there came to be known in our small circle a kind of pollution credit called an anyway credit, which is a credit that would have occurred anyhow. And at federal level and for those programs, those credits were not allowed to be used for the purposes that the programs were designed for. But in the Virginia program, anyway credits are the legislative priority. The statute says that if you sign up for this program, you must provide a certain number of RECs, and that, for instance, for Dominion, and I don't mean to pick on them, but they are the largest generator in the state, the first tranche of renewable energy credits, or RECs, must come from pre-existing hydropower sources owned by the company, already owned by the company. Okay? And for Dominion, because Virginia has actually a fair amount of hydro, most of Virginia's obligation is satisfied by hydropower projects that that Dominion owns now and has owned forever. Then, the next priority under the statute, once you exhaust that category, is renewable energy credits generated by pre-existing sources elsewhere in the country, elsewhere in the PJM control area, which extends out to Michigan. That can be acquired for the lowest possible cost. And what that means is that whatever is not satisfied by what Dominion already owns, Dominion should, under the statute, go out in the market and purchase renewable energy credits, the renewable energy credits that are the cheapest on the market. And as we'll get into detail later on, those credits, the ones that cost nothing to generate, are credits from other renewable energy sources that were built decades ago and don't have to do anything to change their behavior to create the REC. So if you have a pulp mill that was built 40, 50 years ago, and it's burning black liquor to make steam, as they have since at least a half century, that qualifies, it's renewable. It's pre-existing, and it's cheap. Recently, the program was modified to include in this scheme that your means of meeting the state's renewable portfolio goal is reasonable and prudent. Dominion submitted an application, and APCO, which is a subsidiary of AEP, also submitted an application. I have reviewed and provided to Debra, and I think we can make it available online, the State Corporation Commission staff's review of the Dominion application, which sets out in great detail the numbers that are involved. On this slide, you see the case number where if you want to go to the State Corporation Commission docket, you can obtain the document yourself. The State Corporation Commission looked at Dominion's plan. Dominion's plan at the time was to buy what are called Tier 2 RECs, which are renewable energy certificates that are considered less environmentally protective than Tier 1 RECs. Because people just make value judgments about what forms of renewable were better than the others. At the time, Tier 2 RECs cost a lot less than Tier 1 RECs. And so Dominion told the State Corporation Commission, well, we may someday, this program runs through 2025, we may at some point do some renewables, but our main plan for satisfying this program is to buy Tier 2 RECs on the open market. There's a brokerage arrangement, you can just buy them. And that will cost, net present value through 2025, $7.9 million, which is pretty cheap. they observed at the time that Tier 1 RECs would cost $221 million net present value. These are the more environmentally beneficial type of RECs through 2021. Now, under the program, any of those costs for actually acquiring the RECs or installing renewables would be recoverable by Dominion as a cost and passed through to the consumers. What I'm going to call a participation bonus, the 5.5% on equity, the State Corporation Commission at that time said was $39 million, based on the then estimates. A net present value of $330 million through the year 2025. But, as I mentioned earlier, they looked at the fine print and said that actually could rise, if Dominion met the performance incentives, to $987 million. Now, next slide. The problem with all of this, and I say it is a problem, is that the ratepayers are paying Dominion all of the costs of purchasing the RECs and a bonus of up to $1 billion in net present value to go shopping, for agreeing to participate in the program. I would submit that since the program requires that these RECs not incentivize new renewables, that there's a problem with this. The state of Maryland has a similar scheme. They don't provide the bonus money, but they have a renewable program standard that must be met, but they allow these anyway credits that I've been discussing. They recently audited their program to see where these RECs were coming from and published a report. And more than half of their RECs for 2010 came from 5 sources, just to illustrate the problem. 2 of the sources were hydropower plants, one in New York State, one I think maybe Pennsylvania. One of those hydropower plants started operation in 1901, and the other started in 1911. It's renewable, but if you don't timestamp the generation, you wind up simply providing an additional stream of revenue and not incentivizing new generation. The other 3 of the top 5 sources were pulp mills, one in Virginia, one in Pennsylvania, and the third one I don't forget where. But again, they had been burning, they were started operation in the 60s and 70s and had been burning black liquor for energy generation since they started. And again, there's almost nothing in the Maryland program that represents incentivized new generation. These kinds of programs simply move money around and don't incentivize new renewables. North Carolina and Delaware, North Carolina actually, well, both of them, actually require new renewables. They have targets that look less stringent, but were very carefully designed. I mean, North Carolina program, they spent a lot of money and time and effort to design a program that you might or might not agree with the goals, but they designed a program that would actually meet the goals that they thought were feasible. Again, there is a strong focus on new, and there's a requirement that a majority, I think it's 75 or 80%, of those RECs be generated in-state. This is common in solar REC programs, but it has been done and it is being done in other programs where if you really want to incentivize the development of wind power, let's say in Virginia, one could revisit the structure of the RPG, put more money into actual development assistance funds rather than as such a large bonus to the companies for participating, require that the renewables be new and require that they be local. Next slide. Okay. Yeah, this slide shows us the difference between what I call anyway credit prices and real REC prices. This is from 02 to 07, and you see a huge difference in price. The Massachusetts prices are in yellow there. Massachusetts has a very strict program that requires actual real renewables in the region, and so you see prices up around $50 per megawatt hour. That's 5 cents a kilowatt hour. That is more than enough to cover the cost difference between fossil fueled energy and wind power. On the bottom, in pink there, we see, no, the blue X's are Maryland's prices. All right, it's about maybe $1 to $2 per REC, and that's pretty much what things are now. I should say, by the way, that since 2007, REC prices in Massachusetts and Connecticut have stabilized. They've come down to 20 to 30. I think this represents a shortage driving prices up, where $20 to $30 per megawatt hour more accurately reflects sort of long-term market conditions, in that it more accurately reflects the cost of the differential cost of generation. And these kinds of prices are what Dominion reported in their program to the State Corporation Commission. I would submit that at 1/10 or 2/10 of a cent per kilowatt hour, these kinds of REC prices do not stimulate new renewables. Okay, then we get to the decision of the State Corporation Commission in the APCO case. APCO, Appalachian Power, serves the western part of the state. At about the same time that Dominion was submitting its proposed plan to use Tier 2 RECs for compliance, APCO put in its plan. And APCO wanted to buy power from a new wind farm. Now, the wind farm wasn't in Virginia, but it was new. And they submitted their application, and the State Corporation Commission looked at it. And I think this may be a situation where hard facts make bad law, because this came up at a time on the heels of several rate increases that APCO had requested to resolve some lawsuits filed by the Department of Justice Environmental Enforcement Section about their pollution controls. And so it came right after 1, 2, 3, and now 4. Well, the Commission looked at it and rejected APCO's plan. Several things are disturbing about it. One, they said, well, since you don't need this particular wind farm to meet your cap, your target for this year, we're not going to allow it. Even if you need it 3 or 4 years from now, too bad. Of greater concern, however, is they acknowledge that the price in the power purchase agreement for this wind power was reasonable for this kind of stuff. But they said that's a lot more than buying Tier 2 RECs. And we suggest, they didn't hold, but they suggested that maybe APCO ought to go back and revise its plan to find a lower cost approach to meeting these goals, which would be Tier 2 RECs. An additional concern is that the State Corporation Commission has not released publicly the price of the power purchase agreement. So other developers don't know what figure was too high. You're never going to know what they approve until they approve it, but no one knows right now the price that was rejected as too high compared to the price of using anyway credits. There was a legislative proposal to fix this. And as you see, as it went in, the proposal was that the Commission should consider the extent to which renewable energy furthers the objective of the Commonwealth energy policy. And the Commonwealth energy policy is the all of the above policy that you heard the keynote speaker address, and it specifically endorses facilitating new renewable energy and all of that good stuff. It was then amended as it went through the legislative process to add in and whether the cost of such resources is likely to cause an increase in rates. I would think Dominion's system is so large that you know, a 200 megawatt land-based farm is not going to have a significant impact in rates. APCO's Virginia system is much smaller, so I guess I would leave it as this is hanging out there. One does not know how the State Corporation Commission is going to react to this, whether it's going to take the hint. On paper, by the way, the state energy policy is supposed to apply to all state agencies, and they're all supposed to take it into account when making decisions. A number of people that I have talked to are highly skeptical that this is going to make any change. And importantly, you know, an investor has to get pretty far down the road with his investments and expenses before he'll find out whether his power purchase agreement with a regulated Virginia utility would be approved, or whether it would be part of this program. I should say, that doesn't mean that you can't have a wind farm in Virginia. You can have a wind farm in Virginia and sell the electricity to the University of Maryland or out of Virginia into, well, Maryland generally is unregulated states. I don't think the State Corporation Commission would have any problem with the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity. It's just that it's, I think, highly unlikely that they would approve any new wind contracts proposed by Dominion or whoever, where it's not needed for that program, and B, where the cost is higher than existing rates for existing fossil fuel plants. Okay, now we turn to the eastern side of the state. If you remember, we looked at the wind maps, and the Eastern Shore region and the bays were another area where there's a potential for wind power. The legislature asked the Virginia Marine Resources Commission to look at this potential and let the legislature know whether there was any potential for development of this resource. And the general take from the Virginia Marine Resources report is, nope, just nothing available. However, if you go back and into the details of the report, you'll see that they very broadly, and they had no budget to do this. I'm not criticizing them for the lack of depth. I'm just saying that because of the lack of depth, one shouldn't put too much weight on this. But they identified these shipping lanes that go off horizontally out of the main channel of the Chesapeake as an excluded area. Can't go there. Well, you know, if you look, they're not shipping lanes. That's shallow water. There are small towns in there where crabbers or others may use fishing boats of 30 feet, 40 feet to go in and out occasionally. And there are a couple areas where there's some barge traffic. But these are not shipping lanes. They excluded large areas in the center core of the bay because in some parts of those areas there are oystering grounds. Then they went down for major conflicts, anything less than 2 meters. They walled off the whole area. There's on top of each other. You have to peel these maps back to get the full picture. But from here down is major conflicts with continental birds. And in through here you have navigational. This area was lesser conflicts. Okay, and that's near Patuxent and all that. It's quite large. It's certainly large enough for several commercial-sized wind farms. And if you look at their definition of lesser conflicts, it's areas where there aren't conflicts. But yet, the commission, in its sort of overarching statement, basically said that there's no room in the Chesapeake, in Virginia, for commercial-scale wind farms, and that has been the general takeaway from that. North Carolina did a much more detailed study and found some places where they said could be developed if people wanted to. Certainly this area here, and there's been interest expressed over here and onshore here, are areas that are suitable for development. I would note that Accomack County over there has been highly supportive of wind generation. And I think we're up to our last slide. One more. This is the point. In the VMRC designated this area here as unsuitable because of navigational conflicts. This is the north span of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, north of the tunnel. It's 12 to 20 feet of water, and the bridge height is something like 60, 70 feet. You're not going to get ocean-going vessels go through there. This is existing wind turbines at the entrance to Copenhagen Harbor. And basically, they built their turbines on the shallow water that's outside the channel. It's not a
Yeah, just would like to introduce Ken Hutcheson, and he's not going to have any slides, so we won't have any technical problems.
Bruce did a great job of covering a couple of the key points related to policy barriers for land-based and offshore wind development in Virginia. There are a couple others that I'd like to just run through real quick. Because my background is policy. By trade, I'm a lobbyist at Williams Mullen law firm in Richmond. And a few years ago, I was monitoring Governor Kane's efforts through his Climate Change Commission, and noticed that any and all comments and input during that commission process related to renewable energy was coming from either the academic perspective or the environmental community perspective. And I thought it was a little odd that there wasn't a business voice for renewable energy in Virginia, or if there was one, there wasn't one present. And so I spent a couple of months doing some due diligence trying to determine whether there was, in fact, a business community in Virginia dedicated to renewable energy, and started to piece together a little network that has grown quite a bit in the last couple of years. But back in 2008, when we were first looking into this, there was no organized voice for business at the public policy level if you were a member of the renewable energy community in Virginia. So founded the association in late 2008 and launched into our first session in January of 2009, trying to help public policymakers understand the benefits for renewable energy from the business perspective, the economic impact that it would have on the Commonwealth of Virginia. And we've been moderately successful in some cases, but it's an uphill battle, and I've got a couple of things that I'll just share with you, most of which I think most folks in this room will probably already be aware of, so I apologize if some of it's repetitious. I think the top three reasons all could be contained in one word, and that's cost. The State Corporation Commission, the General Assembly, who is elected by ratepayers, are very cost hypersensitive in Virginia. The cost of power has become a political issue, and that is not lost on members of the General Assembly who oversee policy development for electric production in Virginia. Natural gas costs being at a record all-time low, and with supply just for the foreseeable future, that really does, in Virginia, depress any interest in renewable energy because natural gas is so cheap. And in fact, there are a lot of stories being written now about what natural gas is doing to the coal industry, which 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you wouldn't have believed that the coal industry in Virginia could be threatened by anything. The State Corporation Commission, which Bruce spoke a lot about, I don't want to touch too much on it, but it's run by 3 judges, none of whom could be labeled a champion of renewable energy, one of whom I'm fairly confident, based on several conversations, authored the language that Bruce alluded to water down the legislation that our association pursued in 2011 that I call the Invenergy fix, but Don, that's my nod to you. The bill sailed out of the House once we've got some buy-in from the utilities, and it got to the Senate Commerce and Labor Committee, and then out of thin air appears this watered-down language by one of the members of the state Senate who is known to have a very close relationship with one particular judge at the State Corporation Commission. I'm not big on conspiracy theories, but I can do simple math. And so what started out as a legitimate effort to help not completely unravel the Utility Re-Regulation Act of 2007, but to give the State Corporation Commission just an extra added ability to review renewable projects with a little bit more latitude. That's all we were trying to do, to give renewable developers just a little bit more ability to meet a threshold for approval at the State Corporation Commission. As Bruce indicated, that language was inserted. It did pass. It's been, I've heard through the grapevine that the State Corporation Commission really does not view that legislation as anything more than paper, and it probably is not going to make a huge difference in renewable development. Another issue on the policy front that I think is a huge barrier is what I think everybody's familiar with as NIMBYism. In Virginia, local governments retain control of their land use decisions, so zoning and whatnot. These kind of projects must go before local planning commissions and boards of supervisors for approval. And we witnessed very early on, before any development was even mentioned in a serious capacity, Patrick County prospectively passed an ordinance that would prohibit any development of wind energy in Patrick County, which has some great resources, relatively speaking, to Virginia. And then a member of our association, Dominion, was actively pursuing a project in Tazewell County, and the Board of Supervisors, I believe on a 4-3 vote, denied zoning or passed an ordinance that, in effect, would preclude Dominion from building turbines, wind farm in Tazewell County. Those of us representing renewable energy developers saw that as a huge threat to further development in Virginia, and was really sent out a chill to the development community that Virginia isn't open for business. So Frank Wagner introduced legislation on our behalf that would have mandated localities to permit or zone renewable energy projects with some safeguards. And as you might imagine, local government in the Commonwealth of Virginia was heard from. And at the end of the day, the utilities and the association and local governments work together And Senate Bill 862, which was passed in the 2011 session, said, in effect, that when considering renewable energy projects, localities must take into account, I have the actual language somewhere, but I'm not going to read it, the certain safeguards, but they cannot pass unreasonable restrictions that would preclude development. And so we thought that would be a huge plus in trying to attract further development in Virginia. Subsequently, you've seen a good bit of NIMBYism in Roanoke County with the Invenergy project. That's not the sole reason I think that they delayed the project. Tazewell obviously had its fair share. Floyd County has undertaken a very aggressive posture against wind. I think they were on the verge of passing an ordinance to ban it outright, but I think their county attorney was made aware of the statute that was passed in 2011, and so now they've got a local task force examining what an ordinance might look like, but I'm quite confident it will not be very friendly to wind development. Highland New Wind Development, they experienced a great deal of NIMBYism as the pioneer project in the state, and probably have a lot of scars and battle stories that they could share with folks in the room about that. Moving forward into some of the other, I think, I don't want to label these insignificant, but I think there's a litany of policy items or political realities, as I like to call them, that preclude further, more aggressive development in Virginia. Obviously, the lack of a renewable portfolio standard does send signals to developers that, hey, if we're going to go to the investment community and borrow millions of dollars, let's go deploy those resources in states that have a mandatory RPS because we know that they need to develop projects. So Virginia is not going to be on the first wave or probably second wave of development because of that. But that's not, I don't think that's a deal breaker at the end of the day if we could fix some of the other issues. I would note that in a presidential cycle that we're in now, one of the very saddest realities of renewable energy, wind in particular, is that the topic has become a partisan issue. I'm not sure if energy policy has always been partisan, but certainly in the last decade or so, you have seen the polarization of energy issues. And I think both parties are to blame for that. You've got Republicans who have been very aggressive about domestic production, coal, natural gas, offshore drilling, and then you've got Democrats who have embraced renewable energy in greater measures, energy efficiency measures in greater measures. And so you've got big business, coal, natural gas industry, Republicans kind of huddled up over here, and you've got environmental groups and Obama and renewable energy companies over here. And while that's not necessarily how anybody, I think, thought was a wise way to structure the conversation, that's the narrative that's being driven today, and in no more clear terms than the whole fallout from the Solyndra debacle. But the fact remains, renewable energy has become a partisan issue, and so it makes it very difficult for Republicans who might be very inclined to see more renewable energy developed in Virginia because it would be a domestic resource that we're taking advantage of. But they've got these Republican activists over here who are looking at them like, oh, they're going to get in bed with the environmental community and the partisan Democrats. And same thing over here on the left, you've got Democrat activists and environmental groups who really are holding Democrat politicians' feet to the fire on traditional sources of fossil fuels and further production. So it's become really, I think, a very unfortunate situation, and I don't really see any significant change on that front coming anytime soon. utilities certainly play a role in renewable energy in the discussion here in Virginia, and the leadership certainly, I think you could safely say, and I don't say this as a criticism, but the leadership of the two primary utilities in Virginia really aren't bought into the theory that renewable energy is going to be a major source of supply here in Virginia at a cost-efficient and reliable manner. And that is important to note, but it's also important to note that they are part of publicly traded companies, and I kind of view them as being beholden to 4 different buckets of interest groups that makes it very difficult to warmly embrace renewable energy. First, you've got your ratepayers, and ratepayers really don't care about anything except, are my lights going to come on, is my air conditioning going to work, and am I going to pay as cheap a possible rate for it? That's one bucket. Number 2, and I think very important, is the shareholders. The shareholders of these companies, they don't care about anything other than is the leadership doing a good job, is the company well managed, and are my dividend checks coming, and what is the stock performance? The General Assembly, in a regulated state, the General Assembly, Commerce and Labor Committees, and elected leadership have tremendous say over what the business plan for these utilities are. And so the utilities have to cater to what the mood and will of the General Assembly is. And fourth, and this is something that I think goes lost a lot of the time, but in a regulated state, the State Corporation Commission oversees just about every major decision affecting the business units of these utilities. And that's probably a gross oversimplification, but in the interest of time, I don't want to spend too much on it. But you've got these utilities that have 4 very important buckets or stakeholders that they have to appease every single day of every single hour. And that makes it a little challenging for renewable energy in Virginia in a regulated market where independent power producers have a very difficult time bringing projects online. And so I'm not asking for anybody to feel sorry for the utilities, but just keep a broader perspective about the challenges they face, because it's not as simple as just saying, today we're going to embrace renewable energy, because there's so many other moving pieces that have got to be addressed before I think the utilities are going to be interested in investing in the kind of scale and development that the rest of us would like to see. Production tax credit uncertainty at the federal level. If you're a developer, and this is where Invenergy's Poor Mountain project, I think, also had some factors. The uncertainty surrounding the renewal of the production tax credit, I think, is playing a tremendous role in kind of halting interest in Virginia as well as other states until that issue gets sorted out. Same with independent power producers' ability to develop projects in Virginia. It's reliant upon, in most cases, if you want to sell that power into the Virginia market, you would have to go through the 2 utilities utilizing power purchase agreement models. APCO was willing to do that with Invenergy, and I think they've probably got a little bit of a sour taste in their mouth after their experience with the State Corporation Commission. And back to that whole shareholder issue I mentioned, bond rating agencies apparently on Wall Street view these power purchase agreements as long-term debt that affects a utility's balance sheet, and therefore that puts downward pressure on their stock price. That's above my pay grade, but that's the way it's been explained to me as to why power purchase agreements aren't necessarily very intriguing to utilities in Virginia. I wasn't around engaged in renewable policy in 2007, but the move Virginia undertook in the late 90s, I think 99, 98 timeframe, to a deregulated market. It was a very turbulent time frame, I think, in utility relationship with the Commonwealth. And at some point during that process, I think all sides realized deregulation in Virginia was not taking shape, was not accomplishing the goal it set out to do. And in 2007, the Commonwealth re-regulated the utility markets. And that's about the time I started paying attention a little bit. But from what I've gathered, it was a very traumatic experience for everybody. And efforts by the renewable energy industry to try and find ways to come in after the re-reg legislation of 2007 and try to open up a few doors have been met with a little, needless to say, unwelcome because there just isn't an appetite to reopen the re-reg issue. I'm running out of time, but the final point that I'll take up with regards to why we're not seeing more renewable development, it goes back to the cost issue a little bit and economic development, and that is Virginia constantly touts its low cost compared to its neighboring states, and we've enjoyed that because of our traditional use of coal, natural gas, and nuclear power. And the states where you've seen tremendous development have been in higher cost states. Virginia has enjoyed low energy costs, relatively speaking, to our neighbors. Our economic development folks in Richmond cite those costs when trying to attract new manufacturing projects. And it's ironic, but when we talk about renewable policy at the General Assembly, the first folks at the door who want more manufacturing in Virginia are the same folks trying to, I think, weigh in on the debate, not in our favor, but the manufacturing community, the paper companies, the coal and natural gas lobbies, all have been very reticent to embrace any kind of policies in Virginia that might cause even a fraction of a cost increase in Virginia. And they commonly cite, layoffs, jobs, and competitive advantages with the other states. And, to a legislator who understands very little about energy policy, having their local manufacturer call up and say, if our power prices go up, we're going to have to lay off people, that is a very powerful message. And it makes our job and our mission that much more challenging because, as most of you all know, energy policy is very complicated, very hard for a part-time legislator to ever really fully understand. And so those are some of the barriers on the policy and political front that I see. And I didn't touch much on offshore because Al will do a great job on that. But thank you all very much for your time. I appreciate it, and look forward to talking to you all after the event.
Okay, we're going to finish now with Al Christopher, the director of the Virginia Energy Office, and then we'll go into some questions.
Technical difficulties? All right. Well, as long as I can see them, at least I can move forward. I think my job is what I'm going to talk about is offshore wind, and my agency and the energy division within that agency is tasked with helping to facilitate private development of that wind resource. And after hearing Bruce and Ken, I think first I need to ask for a raise. And I'd like a letter of support from each of you that I can use to support my request. I didn't think the barriers were that high. Do we have them? We're trying. Okay. All right, well, I'll go ahead, and I will cheat a little bit by looking at the screen. Gosh, I can't even read that. It's so small. Oh, thank you. The moderator had the foresight to print my slides. I'm so dependent on the digital world, I never expected I would need anything on paper here. But I'm going to start off with the sort of the policy makers and the framework the policy framework within which I work, and I'm not going to speak any broader than my little part of the world. And of course, we're an executive branch agency, so our boss is the governor. So needless to say, we look to the governor for policy direction, and he's made plenty of statements about his energy policy, and they've been repeated a couple of times today. The General Assembly also is a policy maker and establishes a lot of the framework within which we can work. One of the things the General Assembly did in 2007, I believe, was create an organization called the Virginia Coastal Energy Resource Consortium. And that was a consortium of, I think, 8 universities, 8 partner universities and 6 government and industry partners that for several years was funded. And then after the economic downturn, the funding disappeared, but VCERC has continued to operate in some capacity. And it basically informed what is now, I guess, the strategy, or one of the strategies for developing Virginia's offshore wind resource. There was a final report. James Madison University was one of the key players in that, as well as Virginia Tech, Old Dominion, William and Mary, UVA, and I shouldn't have started listing them because now I can't remember everybody. But that work of those organizations informed much that's happened after that on the policy level for offshore wind in Virginia. Then there are the federal program and rules, since the offshore wind area is entirely in federal waters. The Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is the body that regulates how this process works. And so there is a close working relationship between Virginia and all the mid-Atlantic, all the coastal states, on how to proceed with that process. And it's a learn by trial and error process since it's never been done. Then there are numerous Virginia agencies, and I think you've heard reference to many of them today from the keynote speaker and from Debra, Bruce, and Ken this afternoon. And they include the Department of Environmental Quality, the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, which was mentioned, and my agency, the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. We are tasked with a broad spectrum of energy work, but our mission includes the statement to enhance the development and conservation of energy and mineral resources in a safe and environmentally sound manner to support a more productive economy. And you'll hear this theme of economic development and economic benefits a lot in terms of the policy that shapes and frames offshore wind development. Then is to facilitate you've also heard a lot from several speakers this morning and this afternoon, or at lunch and this afternoon, about the need to work with many stakeholders and interests. And nowhere is this more of an issue, I think, than wind.
Got it up.
There we go. Land and offshore wind energy development. So this federal Virginia task force includes representatives from industry, from the marine community, from the port, from investor-owned utilities and member-owned utilities, many military representatives, the Wallops Space Flight Center, and others to try to collaborate. And I hearken back to some of the themes that our lunch keynote speaker addressed for you of aligning getting everybody on the same page, because so many actors have to cooperate and work in concert for anything to happen. Ken mentioned that the State Corporation Commission is a big player and yet often overlooked participant in the process. They're going to have to play a vital role in whatever happens with offshore wind and land wind. Then there was a focused tool that was created by the legislature and the governor in 2010, the creation of the Virginia Offshore Wind Development Authority, VAREA. And that organization also represents the same kind of cross-section that I mentioned before for the task force. The chairman is actually the president or executive director of I think it's president of the Virginia Maritime Association, which has a lot to say about where turbines belong and don't belong off the coast of Virginia. And VAREA is really a primary tool to both develop and implement offshore wind policy. And it has some capacity and authority that makes it that valuable tool. The very first step, and you can take the next slide, please, that was taken by VAREA when it was created was a survey of the industry and others, but it was focused at the industry that we could identify that is associated with development of offshore wind and the likely supply chain players that would be created around a large offshore wind development. So it looked at both policy and economic drivers. And I won't bore you by going through, I think you might be able to read those. You can see on the left side of the screen that a lot of the drivers that are included in RPS, and obviously a mandatory RPS is going to be more effective. And limiting the renewables to Virginia would also encourage greater likelihood of the development of wind resource in the state. But these are not current policy. These were sort of the recommendations of this vast array of folks that were surveyed. And the focus that I think my agency and VAREA, and this is reflective, I believe, and hope, of the higher up in the administration, has been on the second two boxes to the center and right. And those are project cost and developer cost. And those are where we have focused the limited resources, although substantial compared to some of the other projects that we are able to fund. We've focused our effort on reducing those costs to the extent that we can, and otherwise facilitating and expediting the process that any developer has to go through to get to the point of what the industry likes to say of steel in the water. So some of the initiatives and aspects to lowering those two primary barriers are listed here. And one I think several people have addressed already. The industry spoke loud and clear that they would like regulatory certainty. They like clear, simple, certain path of regulations and permitting, and a timetable that is reasonable. And some of the work that has occurred in the state to help accomplish that would include, I think we already heard mentioned today earlier, the Department of Environmental Quality has developed the wind permit by rule regulation and the wind PBR guidance document. And those became effective at the end of 2010. And they should expedite and clarify the regulatory, at least some of the regulatory hurdles that a wind project has to clear, and reduce the cost of that. And the biggest cost is the delay of the project. And hopefully that, it's been tested on a smaller scale. We have not yet had an auction to actually see if any of the 8 developers who expressed an interest in developing Virginia's wind energy area will participate to actually buy the lease, and that's expected possibly by the end of this year. Then the second item which I don't think we can emphasize enough, is to identify and engage the various stakeholders. And we've heard the term NIMBYism mentioned. That's just one of the issues. I mentioned SCC, others have mentioned how the SCC interplays in this scenario. If there's going to be any success, the maritime community, the military community, the ocean is a busy, busy place. And there are a lot of, there's a lot of radar impacts. There are both navigational radar on planes and ships, and defense radar installations that are all along the East Coast. And obviously, one of our biggest assets in the port also is the reason that we have such a large military presence in the Hampton Roads part of the state, especially naval presence. And those stakeholders all have to be at the table. They have to be engaged. They have to know what your plans are so that they can tell you when there are issues that are going to be showstoppers for them. If you don't have them at the table, if you haven't identified all these stakeholders, and this, I'm speaking from our perspective, but this would be a developer's perspective, anyone who's going to develop wind energy offshore Virginia or anywhere else. If you haven't identified all of those folks and organizations and engaged them, then you're going to have maybe an impossible road to hoe. One of the other opportunities that we leverage or have tried to leverage is the federal funding opportunities. Because offshore wind is in its infancy globally, and especially in North America, I guess, or in the United States, there is still a lot of technology being developed, a lot of new approaches being considered to lower the cost of, supposed to improve the performance of the turbines and to lower the cost of everything associated with the turbines, the operation and maintenance, the construction, the deployment, what you do when a hurricane comes. You know, all of those areas still are ripe for research, and a lot of the activities of VAREA for the last year and a half have been focused on informing and positioning Virginia and players involved in offshore wind development in Virginia to be an effective competitor for these federal funds. There was recently a funding opportunity that closed May 31st, and at least one Virginia team has applied for that money. That was long anticipated, and that's why we were able to plan for it. The Department of Energy announced that they were going to do this, and then because of funding considerations, they put those plans on hold for a while and came back to them. One of the other steps we've taken at DMME, the agency applied for a research lease, and only a state agency or a state or a federal agency and maybe a tribe can apply for a research lease. And a research lease is the kind of work short of actually deploying turbines, but a lot of the work that is necessary both to inform whether and how the turbines can be deployed, the cost of that, and investigating all the environmental issues that could be associated with turbine deployment. So that research lease application is now pending before BOEM, and we believe that it will be awarded soon, and that it will be a great advantage to facilitate commercial development of the Virginia WIA. The next bullet is cost sharing. And under that general category, the first bullet, sub-bullet, is data collection. And that I'm referring to that kind of work that would be associated with a research lease, installation of a Met tower to collect real-time micro-located wind resource data and other data that is needed to inform the development. The advanced technology demonstration that I just mentioned, that is what the federal funding opportunity solicited, projects that would demonstrate turbine deployment in ocean-like conditions and other projects that would be related to turbine deployment, such as innovative ways to provide foundations and install foundations for turbines, for example. Ways to mitigate against radar interference is another example. And the governor managed to identify about $500,000, and we're pretty grateful in these tough times that is enough, we think, to do significant work in both of those areas, to offer cost share opportunities with others who would develop the wind energy area, both for data collection, pre-construction type of data collection, and for the successful award, if Virginia is a successful recipient of the Advanced Technology Award, to offer cost share for parts of that project. Then the last item, we at the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy were tasked with administering a lot of energy funds that were allocated to each state under the Recovery Act. And I would like to think, very strategically allocated funds to help with, to advance the offshore wind energy development cause. And one of those went to Gamesa, the Spanish company that actually received the state permit from VMRC in March, I believe, toward the end of March, to erect a 600-foot turbine 3 miles off of Cape Charles. It was the first large scale, this was a 5 megawatt or 6 megawatt turbine, the first one approved by a state, I believe. And unfortunately, as you know, Gamesa is a Spanish company, and they've had a lot of difficulties. You know, there are economic difficulties in Spain, as well as economic difficulties faced by that company because of its activities in all around the world. And they have withdrawn from the Virginia operation and said they're going to work in the Canary Islands instead. Nonetheless, I think their work helped advance makes it easier for anybody who falls in their path. The next entity, Poseidon Atlantic, I'm running out of time, aren't I? 25 after?
Yeah,
one more minute?
We've got till 3:30 for questions, so.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, that
Oh.
clock is not right.
I keep
It's
looking at that.
3:25.
Okay, yeah, okay.
I'll hurry through.
Yeah,
Poseidon
please.
Atlantic
Yeah.
is a United States company with roots to the Netherlands, and they are still involved in their project, which was to determine the feasibility of siting a wind turbine testing facility in Virginia waters or offshore. And that project is underway. They have run into a couple of barriers. One is an FAA navigational interference barrier, and the other is a grid study to determine what would need to be done to improve the grid to accept the power from several test turbines. Then the last two items, Virginia Tech Advanced Research Institute and James Madison University both received grants to research and to explore that regulatory path in Virginia to help. And the James Madison University report is not out yet, but it will be soon, and it will be online. And Dr. Miles mentioned in the opening remarks, I believe, that a lot of this data will be on the website soon. And there were two aspects of that. One was a lot of collection of scientific data, which is ongoing, as well as the part that is finished. Some of it's finished. And the second aspect is a very depth analysis of the regulatory and permitting processes and exploring that with state, federal, and other entities to help define the path and ease the path for a developer who would have to go through all those regulatory and permitting hurdles. And I believe that is it. The last slide is just my contact information.
I think that we're going to break time, but what I'd like to do is continue for 15 more minutes. Jonathan?
Yeah, that's fine. I checked with Remy and explained the technical difficulties y'all had. She said another 15 minutes.
Okay. So, Howard, do we need to pass around the microphone?
We'll bring them on down.
Oh, okay. Okay, so why don't you get the first...
Debra.
Okay, the first question, is there any reason to hope the Virginia government would act responsibly to reduce carbon emissions through application of renewable energy?
I'm not hopeful.
Yes.
He's the Virginia governor.
I think Al probably has to say that. I think the political winds are going to need to shift a little bit. Republican control of both the governor's office, the House of Delegates, which is very, very much attuned to the grassroots sentiments on renewable energy, and then the tie in the Senate. I think you're going to have to see some shifting of views in order for meaningful development to take place. I think something's going to have to happen in natural gas costs. I enjoy hearing Al and others who are very passionate about offshore wind energy speak, but until something happens with natural gas, I think the prospects for offshore wind development are slim to none, if for no other reason that the State Corporation Commission will never approve any cost recovery for Dominion if they have cheaper alternatives like natural gas.
And just to add to that, and again, with all due respect to our offshore advocates, some of us, including me, have the view that offshore wind would be great if it happens. And the issue isn't whether the technology can be developed. Of course it can. The question is whether the technology can be developed at the right price. And that's the same question that carbon capture and sequestration faces. That's a challenge, and we don't know. In the meantime, it seems that offshore wind development has become the bright and shining object that distracts attention and policy development for onshore wind power and other renewables. It provides safe harbor for politicians to say, I'm all for renewables because out there in federal waters, way out of sight, where I'm not going to get any flack from my in-state constituents about viewshed issues, somebody else, i.e. the feds, may develop this resource, and because it's near Virginia, it's not in Virginia, but because it's near Virginia, I can kind of claim it.
Okay, we have two other questions that are similar. I'm going to modify one a little bit. It talks about, it says, since the SEC has ruled in the APCO case that onshore wind power costs associated with the out-of-state purchase were not reasonable and prudent, what is the likelihood that the SEC will approve offshore costs, since these costs are several times onshore costs? But what I would like to add is that George Hagerman, who was one of the folks working on offshore wind, did a comparison with nuclear. And if you look, which is being advocated for Virginia, and if you, his back-of-the-envelope estimates showed that nuclear was far more expensive than offshore wind. And so I guess I'd like to ask folks to kind of put that in context to answer both this question about offshore wind, but also in the context of nuclear.
I would say, if you look at the Delaware example, Delaware, the governor and the state legislature were strongly behind offshore wind, and so they passed a bill that directed Delmarva Power to enter into a PPA that basically the state legislature sort of overrode the Corporation Commission, the PUC, and said, do this. And I would say that until and unless the Virginia legislature passes a very specific statute directing the Virginia State Corporation Commission to approve a specific power purchase agreement, that it won't happen. In going to your nuclear question, I'm also curious, you know, the State Corporation Commission did approve the construction of the Wise County plant 2, 3, 4 years ago. I don't know what the estimated prices were then, but I do know, well, I don't know what they were then. And I know that there has been at least one new nuclear unit approved by the NRC. I don't know where the PUCs are.
Okay, in terms of the Virginia plant, they have a pending an application before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Maybe Al knows what the status is in terms of an application for the State Corporation Commission for Nuclear. I don't know.
But I think, didn't TVA get an approved license for
No,
new?
it's Southern Company, Georgia Power.
I don't, Molly left, but I recall in the Integrated Resource Plan, Dominion said that they have their application for the 2 additional units is inactive but not dropped.
Not suspended.
Yeah.
Just to, I think, top that off, I think one of their funding partners, Old Dominion Electric Co-op, has pulled out of that nuclear project. And I think, again, I mean, you can read it in annual reports, IRPs. Natural gas is the wave of the future for baseload generation, whether it's APCO, whether it's Dominion. They're both on record publicly and in their filings that is the current wave of development for meeting their demand obligations. And I think the point Bruce made, which isn't going to happen in a decade probably, is that there will be no power purchase agreements with IPPs unless they're mandated in Virginia. And I just don't see the political will in the current General Assembly leadership ever putting a mandate like that in place.
I guess to be a little upbeat, I think it depends on it all depends on what the people tell their members of the General Assembly, and each person has a voice, and I would use it. And that is the most optimistic that I can be. Yes, Steve.
I guess I would ask one other question. What about the EPA's regulatory procedures that are going on now on both MAC and carbon dioxide? What's the implication for fossil in the state of Virginia?
I happen to be drafting comments on EPA's proposed EGU rules for carbon, and did draft comments on the MAC rules. The carbon rules will have absolutely no effect on energy in Virginia, precisely because of the point that no one is planning to, these only affect new units, and no one is planning to build new coal anywhere. The rules would apply natural gas emission levels to any new plant, so but they're very loose, if you will, as far as what natural gas. They're easily attainable by natural gas, but would require carbon capture for new coal, but there isn't any new coal on the horizon, so no impact. The MAC rules might require some scrubbers on some units in Virginia, but no big deal. Really, what's causing the closure of plants across the country, coal plants, and there are a lot of them, is, as you point out, the very low price of natural gas generation.
I guess I just want to put one other point on that, even though I'm the moderator. I'm taking a little. There have been articles about some of the utility leaders saying that they got very burnt in the 1990s when they all went to natural gas when natural gas prices were low, and then they shot through the roof. And many of them view that wind and solar are options that do not have fuel prices, and that in terms of just like you diversify your investment portfolio to do some things that are low risk, there are many who view that keeping some renewables in their portfolio is very important. Granted, that doesn't overcome some of the specific hurdles, and the General Assembly would need to understand that, but I think that's a point which people should keep in mind. There was another question. Yeah.
You have a question, but let me just make one more comment. Gas prices are right now half on the spot market, not gas, electricity prices right now on the spot market are half of what they were 3 years ago because of the natural gas glut, and that makes it hard for any new renewable to compete.
Yeah, I think that point that has been made is an excellent point, as well as a very nice breakdown of the properly incentivized RPS, such as you did. I think those are very good points, as well as all the points the panel has made. I would offer maybe two more that might be, I think, good for folks to think about. I think one, on the federal level, I know you have another session to address this, but an investment tax credit rather than a production tax credit. An investment tax credit might well serve the kind of wind resource that you have in Virginia a little better. You've got a lot of transmission difficulty, so you have narrow little margins in order to get onto transmission distribution. And with less wind, basically, if the subsidy is constructed such that you receive benefit after you've actually made the investment rather than production, it can really help the smaller projects. So that's more of a federal matter, though. The other thing that I would mention is if you go forward with a production tax credit, as might occur, or even if you have an investment tax credit, the business models that are applied typically by the very largest developers and that have really scoured Virginia for sites, they tend to be the type that they want to build it, own it, and operate it. And there's a lot of very positive benefits to that model. However, right now, what we're seeing emerging in smaller arenas, maybe smaller projects, is that some of the entrepreneurial companies are looking more to a model that will allow them to build, do all the development work, build the product, and then transfer it. If you have a build-transfer model, you can work around some of the fair and reasonable cost issues that the SEC has cited, and you can also theoretically work around some of the PPA problems that have been pointed out by the panel that are very real. So I guess my point is the federal subsidy, PTC, may not be the best model for Virginia and for states like Virginia. And secondly, the developers perhaps need to look at another model, or hopefully, ideally, new developers will come into this state with different models that consider build transfer.
Anybody want to comment on that? Any other questions? Okay, I think then we'll move to a break. And the next session is on federal policy, and we'll get into the production tax credit status and investment tax credit and other innovative approaches.